Jetzt haben wir ein Video, das wir einspielen, und zwar aus Norwegen von Karl Lund. Dr. Lund ist ein langjähriger Forscher im Tabakbereich. Ich glaube, die letzten 30 Jahre, so lange kenne ich jedenfalls seinen Namen in diesem Bereich und in vielen internationalen Bewegungen der Erforschung von Tabak- und Nikotinschäden involviert. Harm Reduction in Norway, the case of Snooze. Also er wird uns zeigen, welche Bedeutung Snooze in Norwegen hatte. Der Vortrag ist auf Englisch. Schalten Sie bitte nicht ab. Ich glaube, er spricht ein sehr kontinentales Englisch. Ist ja kein Native Speaker. Und das wir auch gut verstehen können. Und er zeigt uns, welche Bedeutung Snooze hat in der Reduktion der Zahl der Rauchenden in Norwegen und in der Reduktion von Folgeproblemen des Rauchens, über die wir gerade gesprochen haben. Einmal COPD und Lungentumore und so weiter. Ja? Jana, würdest du das bitte starten? Wir haben keinen Ton dabei.
Ja, wir müssen das nochmal ausprobieren, ganz kurz.
Ja. Okay.
Katharina teilt den Bildschirm gerade.
Okay.
Vorhin hat es geklappt. Wir probieren es einfach noch einmal.
Ja.
Vielleicht jetzt so. Ich mache es nochmal von Anfang an.
Hi, good afternoon. I'm Karl Lund. I'm a senior researcher.
Funktioniert es?
Sehr gut, sehr gut.
Okay, gut, dann mache ich jetzt los.
At the Norwegian Institute of Public Health. Thank you very much for the invitation to present our long-time experience on snooze use in Scandinavia. It's called a proof concept of harm reduction, and I will show you why in a minute. But first, I will start out more generally by showing you some, rather depressing numbers, I'm afraid. As you know, smoking is one of the most important preventable causes of ill health and death. And according to the American Cancer Society, smoking kills 7.5 million annually, and this number is expected to rise. And in Europe alone, 1.4 million deaths are caused by smoking, and the annual decline in tobacco consumption in Europe is below 1%. So we're not yet at the end game phase of the cigarette epidemic. This is the prevalence of daily smoke in European countries, and you can see Greece and Bulgaria there at the very top with approximately 40% smokers. In Sweden, where users more often consume their tobacco as snooze, is placed at the very bottom with only 4%. Germany in between with 20%, according to this Eurobarometer statistics. So, I mean, after 50 years of systematic tobacco control, there are still 20% daily smokers in Europe on average. But there are no lack of strategy plans that aims to eradicate smoking. And reading these plans is quite a repetitive exercise because they're pretty identical, telling us that the zero vision for smoking will be achieved mainly through intensified use of the traditional, more or less punitive means of tobacco control, like stronger regulations, higher taxes, denormalization of smoking, accompanied by educational means providing more information, stronger warnings, and intensified media campaigns. However, these traditional efforts of tobacco control will be implemented into a modern society that already has been the recipient of these measures for decades. So we will be implementing stronger regulations in societies already fairly well regulated. I mean, the infrastructure for tobacco control is pretty strong in most European countries. We will have tax hikes on products that already appear costly to smokers. You know, smokers who are overrepresented by persons with low income. And we intend to further denormalize the group that is already feeling stigmatized. Smokers already feel bad about themselves. And we will intensify campaigns to an audience already trained in dealing with unwanted information. And we will be putting out more information into populations that are already very well informed that smoking is bad. In fact, smokers tend to overestimate their own risk. So there's no information deficit. So, I mean, there might be marginal returns from intensifying the traditional means of tobacco control. And moreover, we must also acknowledge that the smoker at the receiving end, they have also changed. Now, compared to the smokers we addressed on the health side some decades ago, the remaining smokers have become more persistent and reactant and immune against further attacks on their behavior. And as a group, smokers have gone through a social class descent and have become overrepresented with persons from vulnerable groups, many with mental disorders and thereby lack of coping skills in smoking cessation attempts. So no, smokers doesn't look like this anymore. When smoking was associated with style and high social class, you're no longer scientists and educators smoking Kent with micronite filter. Smokers are no longer doctors, dentists, nurses who recommend cigarettes in the ads. And smokers are no longer the athletes. So, for example, Tour de France sharing a cigarette during the race. No. The smokers nowadays look more like this. You know, I could have shown you tons of statistics illustrating the class descent of smokers, but I mean, this slide really tells it all, I'm afraid. Anyway, society has changed and the smokers have changed, but the tobacco control policy, as expressed in these strategy plans, remains more or less the same. So it is in that perspective that this conference should be very welcomed. In order to curb smoking further, there is a need for a supplementary strategy with a more pragmatic approach where we advise smokers who are unwilling or unable to quit nicotine to switch to low-risk alternatives to cigarettes. In some countries, like the UK and recently also New Zealand, tobacco harm reduction have been embraced by the authorities. They have implemented the core principles of tobacco harm reduction into their tobacco control strategy by making low-risk nicotine products available on the nicotine market, tax them lower than cigarettes. They inform about the risk difference compared to smoking and impose risk proportionate regulation for nicotine products. The challenge of this policy is, of course, not to make these products attractive to non-smokers. And I'll return to this dilemma in a minute. However, there is formidable opposition to tobacco harm reduction within the tobacco control community, most notably from the WHO, but also within the EU, as expressed in the recent Europe Beat Cancer Plan. Within the orthodox tobacco control community, low-risk products are still viewed as part of the tobacco problem and not part of the solution to the tobacco problem. So before I start telling you about Snooze, I just want to draw your attention to the topics that differentiate the opponents and the proponents of tobacco harm reduction. On what topics do they disagree? Well, this is a messy slide. Let's try to uncover some of the disagreements between the opponents and the proponents. Starting on the top, I mean, the ultimate goal of the opponents is tobacco or a nicotine-free society, while the aim of the proponents of tobacco harm reduction is to reduce smoking-related mortality. So that's different. Opponents say nicotine should be limited to therapeutic use only, while proponents claim that recreational use of nicotine will always exist, and we should strive to find the least harmful method of nicotine uptake. Any form of nicotine addiction is unacceptable to opponents, while proponents say we can tolerate addiction if the other health risks are low. And according to opponents, product regulation and taxation should be designed to deter never smokers and the young from trying e-cigarettes or snus, while proponents call for the risk proportionate regulation that would motivate smokers to switch product. And as for risk communication, opponents emphasize the fact that no nicotine product is risk-free, while proponents emphasize the risk continuum between nicotine products. Opponents tend to compare risk to non-use of nicotine, while the competitor for proponents is smoking. And opponents also claim that the risk reduction potential is unknown due to the lack of long-term epidemiological studies, while proponents refer to toxicological and physiological tests that indicate a huge risk reduction. And again, opponents are skeptical to novel non-combustible nicotine products and refer to the precaution principle, while proponents claim novel products may have the ability to outperform cigarettes, so we should not wait another 30 years to put them on the market. Opponents refer to the past misconducts of the tobacco industry and the failure of filter and low tar cigarettes as tobacco harm reduction devices, while proponents welcome tobacco industry's transition from combustible to non-combustible products and have been more willing to cooperate with the industry. So now this is only the short list of differences. I'm sorry about this long introduction, but I think it's important to set the perspective straight before we begin our snooze lesson. So the history of snooze in tobacco harm reduction. Well, in Norway, Sweden, some other countries, we have this product called snooze. It's an oral low toxicity smokeless tobacco product consisting of pasteurized finely ground tobacco leaves. It comes in small tea bags, which are placed under the upper lip. It's very discreet to use. No spitting is required, and provides the nicotine to the bloodstream through the mucosa. It's absolutely not risk-free, but the health consequences are small compared to smoking. You know, when smokers die from smoking-related disease, approximately 2/3 die from either lung cancer, respiratory diseases, or cardiovascular diseases. This according to Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. But for snus, we have epidemiological long-term studies showing none or very weak association with the diseases that are killing 2/3 of the smokers. There's no association with lung cancer or respiratory diseases, and weak, if any, association with heart conditions. And moreover, also important is that snus does not cause any unique diseases beyond those you can get from smoking. So there is a medical consensus among authoritative health bodies that snus puts you at a lower risk than cigarettes, as exemplified in this statement from this organization. Still, they also emphasize that snus is not a safe alternative, it's a safer alternative. There's a difference there. And a recent systematic review from our own institute claimed that snus probably could increase the risk of pancreatic cancer, increase risk of mortality in patients with a heart disease, and probably also increase the risk of premature births in pregnancy, probably also increase the risk of diabetes among users of snus at very, very high consumption. So not safe, but safer. So how do snus compete with cigarettes on the nicotine market? Well, very well, I would say. I've been studying this for 15 years now. I mean, if you go 20 years back, cigarettes made up 93 of the nicotine market and snus only 7%. But now snus has gained nearly a 50% market share on behalf of cigarettes. And overall sales of tobacco has been reduced from 2 kilo per capita to 1 kilo per capita. So the preferences have changed towards harm reducing nicotine uptake. Snus has been displacing cigarettes in Norway. And for many within the tobacco control community, the goal, as I said, is to get rid of all kinds of recreational nicotine use. They want a tobacco-free society. And for those, the increase in snus use is more considered like a standstill. And a special concern has been that some of the increase in the market share of snus might be caused by an influx of otherwise tobacco-free youth. So therefore, it's essential for us researchers to know how the growing group of snus users are composed across smoking status. According to this, we could call it the addiction hypothesis, the availability of snus might attract individuals that are not susceptible for smoking. You might say that these are, the good guys, the clever guys, those youngsters not involved in risk-taking behavior at all and without any predictors of smoking onset. So they would probably could have joined the tobacco-free life if it hasn't been for snus. So that would be no good. The addition hypothesis is supported by the fact that a sharp increase in snus use have occurred in a segment of the population where smoking has been low, namely among the youth. In the age group 16 to 24 years, use of snus increased sharply until it recently leveled off at approximately 25% among males and 15% among young women. So when presented in isolation, separated from the comparator of smoking, these trends worry policymakers and others. But snus also function as an alternative to cigarettes for some consumers. According to the diversion hypothesis, that hypothesis postulates that youth with an elevated drive to engage in risk-taking behavior like smoking will have an alternative in snus. So, the bad guys that otherwise could have picked up cigarettes kind of satisfy their curiosity, sensation-seeking, and drive for norm-breaking behavior by picking up snus instead. And if you add the trends for smoking into the charge for snus, we observe an almost perfect inverse correlation. Smoking is declining to below 5% in parallel with snus increasing. So some potential smokers might have displaced cigarettes by snus. Now, how much of the decline in smoking we can attribute to snus? Well, we don't know exactly. Other countries where snus is unavailable also experience a decline, although not so fast as in Norway. In Norway and Sweden, smoking among youth is practically eradicated, as you can see from this slide. These countries are the only ones in Europe where snus is an available option to cigarettes for youth. Now, the growing market share for snus is also caused by what we call a transition. That is that established smokers, for different reasons, convert to snus, either temporarily or to be used in smoking cessation, or they transit long-term used as a harm reduction tool or as a bridging product where smoking is prohibited. So some of these snus users quit smoking by the help of snus. Others would have quit smoking anyway. And among current dual users, some will become snus users only, while others might fall back to smoking, and some will eventually go totally nicotine-free, quit both products, meaning that the picture here is complex. But as a matter of fact, we, from our long-term research on snooze in Norway, we know a great deal about the transition from cigarettes to snooze. For example, we know that snooze for a long time has been the most used method to quit smoking. I note also here that e-cigarettes are setting up as the second most used method to quit smoking in Norway. And from our comprehensive research in snooze, we also know that average smokers make up the great majority among snooze users. And among former smokers now using snooze, a great majority of 83% reported that snooze, in fact, was the method they used in their final quit attempt. And we know that snooze use is associated with higher expectancy of being smoke-free in 5 years, and that snooze use, in fact, increased the likelihood of quitting smoking within the first 5 years after snooze initiation. And we know also from our research that the quit rate for smoking is higher among snooze users than among smokers who don't use snooze. So we had some pieces in the transition puzzle, but far from all. Now, in the present book, we have a chapter where we present a model to weigh the pros and the cons from non-combustible nicotine products on public health. We present here a conceptual framework that can be used in order to help health authorities to find regulation for these products that will maximize public health. It's quite comprehensive, this model, so I can't go into details. You have to read the chapter, but the effect on public health will depend upon mainly three factors. First, we have to know the excess risk for never smokers who use snooze as compared to non-use. Now, this is called the absolute risk from snooze use. Secondly, we also must know what would be the risk reduction for smokers who switch to snooze compared to continued smoking. So we need to know the risk difference, the relative risk. Third thing we need to know is what will be the relative proportion between smokers and never smokers among the snooze users. So we need to use what you can call the user configuration, how snooze users are composed according to smoking status. And then we apply what we could call a risk use equilibrium. Now, this sounds more difficult than it really actually is. Here we ask in the risk use equilibrium, we ask, given an anticipated risk difference in relation to cigarettes, now, how many of the good guys will have to pick up on snooze in order to offset the health gain from each established smoker or each other bad guys who start to use snooze instead of smoking cigarettes? So we ask, now let's say that the harm from snooze make up 5% of the harm from smoking as suggested by experts, okay, 5%. And then we have one person who permanently and completely switched to snooze. And by that, he reduced his probability of smoking-related disease to 5% of what he would have had as a smoker, as a continued smoker. And then in a public health perspective, 20 never smokers will have to pick up snooze in order to offset the health gain from the one smoker who switch. If this is the case, the public health effect will be unchanged. In other words, among snooze users, the proportion of never smokers has to be more than 20 times greater than the proportion of former smokers to produce a negative net impact on public health. Thus, in the public health calculus, we should put more weight on smokers who switch to snooze than on the one additional adolescent who start to use snooze. And in Norway, we see that never smokers, they tend up to make a minority of the snus users. They're not 20 times greater segment than former smokers. In this national representative data set that comprised more than 10,000 current snus users, both sexes and all ages, we found that former smokers made up close to half of the current snus users. And as you can see, 27% had quit daily smoking, while an additional 19% had quit occasional smoking. And 11% had reduced their smoking intensity from daily to occasional smokers and probably also improved their health. 10% were daily smokers, but these dual users, these 10%, they consumed only half the amount of cigarettes as compared to daily smokers who did not use snus. But the point is that never smokers made up only 23% of the snus users, and that is half the size of the segment for former smokers. So not 20 times greater, but half the size. So let's take the situation in Germany, where there are approximately 20% smokers. Now let's say that all the remaining German smokers switch completely from cigarettes to snus as a response to a tobacco harm reduction policy, making snus available, tax it lower, informing about the risk difference, etc. But at the same time, this tobacco harm reduction policy also made snus so attractive to others, not only to smokers, but also to others, that the entire adult population, in fact, will start to use snus. So no smoking in Germany, but 100% snus use. Well, in that case, the net public health effect would still be positive compared to the situation with 20% smokers and non-snus users, provided that snus make up 5% of the risk from cigarettes. Let's now look at some health indicators. These are data from the Global Burden of Disease study. In Sweden, there's a country with a very, very long history of snus use among men. You can see that the death rates attributable to tobacco are much, much lower than in countries that consume the same volume of tobacco, but in the form of cigarettes. So compared to the rest of Europe, where tobacco is smoked, Swedish men have only half the mortality rate from lung cancer, other smoking-related cancers, and cardiovascular diseases. But they consume the same volume of tobacco, but in the form of snus. However, if you look at Swedish women who tend to smoke their tobacco and not consume snus as much as men, tobacco-related death rates are higher than a female average in the EU countries. And again, this is an indication that consuming tobacco in a non-combustible form seems to be far better than setting fire to tobacco and inhale the smoke into the lungs. Now, finally, in conclusion, based on current knowledge of the moderate risk of snus use relative to non-use, the absolute risk, based on the current knowledge of the huge risk difference between snus use and smoking, what we could call the relative risk, and also based on the current knowledge of the overrepresentation of former smokers and ever smokers relative to never smokers in the snus user population, availability to snus must have produced a net gain to public health in Norway and Sweden. And that's because the combined numbers who have quit smoking for snus, or reduced smoking intensity by snus, or picked up snus instead of cigarettes, have outnumbered snus users who otherwise would have been tobacco-free. So health gains from smoking cessation, smoking reduction, and smoking substitution produced by snus has more than outweighed the marginal health loss in the fraction of never smokers taking up snus. So an implication to that might be to assess the appropriateness of the snus ban in the EU. Well, That's it. Thank you for your attention. Good luck with the rest of the conference. Here's my conflict of interest. I'm employed by a government entity answerable to the Ministry of Health and Care Services. I got no ties to any nicotine industry. In fact, I've been an expert witness in 5 litigation cases against the tobacco industry. So I've had nothing to do with the industry. Okay, thank you very much for your attention. Good luck with the conference. And thank you again for the invitation to talk about these things. Bye-bye.